Hello, everyone, and welcome to Moral Philosophy Through John's Eyes. Today's selection of Johns are John Locke,
Good afternoon.
John Rawls,
Hello.
and John Stuart Mill.
Greetings.
Today, we will begin discussing the clothing policy in the Radnor High School Student Handbook. Let's start with introductions.
Hi, John. I'm John.
Oh, nice to meet you,
Oh, the
How's
pleasure
it
is mine,
going,
John.
How's it
Oh,
going,
sorry.
John?
What's
John,
your name?
hey,
Is it
say
John?
that
Hey,
pretty John.
John.
Sorry, I missed your
Ron.
name.
John with an H? John?
John.
in your
John.
name.
Save that for
Do
the
you
John.
have
John?
that H
John.
in John. Down now, Johns. Let's begin the discussion. First, let's review the clothing policy.
Yes, Radnor High School Student Handbook. I am very familiar with that doctrine.
The selection of the handbook states that no clothing may be worn that disrupts the learning or teaching process. The clothing must follow these guidelines. Is indecent, obscene, offensive, or contains direct or indirect references to sex, drugs, alcohol, violence, or violent groups will not be permitted. Number 2. All tops must have sleeves or shoulder straps. Number 3. All tops must totally cover the body from the belt line to an imaginary line from underarm to underarm. Number 4. The length of skirts and shorts must be at least as long as where the fingertips rest when the arms are hanging at the student's side. Number 5. Tops and bottoms of clothing should not be made of see-through material. Number 6. There should be no visible underwear. Number 7. There should be no midriffs showing. Discuss!
Starting off, I believe that there is a certain social contract established in school. Think of the school as its own government. By enjoying the privileges and protections of the government, also known as the education of the school district, you are implying your consent to the rules and regulations of that specific district.
Although dressing properly may be on the social contract, consent, especially implied consent, may not always be enough to make a contract fair, especially with a hypothetical contract.
How so?
Consider the following scenario. A family moves into Radnor from the middle of Africa, where they had lived a very simple tribal life. In their village, the people wore no shirts and more revealing tunics, for with the great heat of the African sun, it would have been far too hot. The family signs up their child to enroll at Radnor High School, and, upon entering the school district, he or she agrees to the policy of wearing appropriate clothing. However, the family's definition of appropriate clothing is far different than the typical white, wealthy family in Radnor. While the family and their child give their consent to dress appropriately, the child is going to go to school wearing what would be identified as scandalous clothing. The child is punished for doing so. Is this scenario a fair application of the social contract?
Of course not.
Even though consent was given on both sides?
I suppose not.
Then the social contract that is followed by Radnor High School is unfair, even though consent is given. Consent is often not enough to make an agreement fair. One or more of the consenting parties may be ignorant or misinformed of the topic in question.
But the clothing policy offers both autonomy and reciprocity. Both parties consent to it, as discussed before. Reciprocity is present since the student benefits from the contract by receiving an education, and the school district benefits by keeping the school an appropriate learning-based area.
But the previously mentioned hypothetical could still exist with reciprocity in addition to the consent.
A valid point.
John Stuart Mill, you have said barely anything throughout this discussion. Do you have an opinion on the matter?
Thank you for the acknowledgement, John. While I do agree with Rawls's opinion that consent is not always enough, you have completely misinterpreted the kind of consent that has been given.
Are you saying that the students gave outright consent or implied consent to wear appropriate clothing?
Neither. You see, that paper that the students signed in the beginning of the year was indeed about the terms and conditions described in the student handbook. However, they were signing that they understood the terms and conditions, not that they would agree to them. Thus, the students never gave any consent at all to the clothing policy, so the aforementioned African child's punishment would have been both immoral and unfair.
Thought of it that way before.
So are you saying you think that the clothing policy is immoral?
Not necessarily. Different circumstances can be interpreted different ways. In the African child's case, it was immoral. But for a lifelong resident to the area of Radnor, the policy is quite moral. Overall, I believe it maximizes happiness.
But aren't the people who are forced to abide by the clothing policy made unhappy?
The policy of Radnor can be viewed as a beneficial thing. While the restriction of clothing choices will decrease happiness in the short term, the clothing policy can maximize happiness in the long run. While kids may be upset that they can't wear anything they want, a restriction on clothing options will allow students to focus more in school since less distractions will be permitted. This heightened focus will lead to their better grades, which will lead to a student getting into a better college and be able to get the job that they want. Getting the job that they want will give them more happiness since they enjoy what they are doing on a day-to-day basis, and their good grades from college and high school could give them a bigger paycheck, which will lead to more amenities in adulthood.
Ah! I see.
The morality, and I believe I have switched sides on the matter. We humans are entitled to inalienable rights and freedoms that cannot be taken away from us. Among these is freedom of speech. The clothing that you wear is an expression of yourself, a way of speaking out. Therefore, restricting clothing is restricting your freedom to express yourself, which is a violation of the freedom of speech.
I see your point, John, but where do these rights come from?
These rights are rights of being alive, rights that any man is entitled to.
But what about a woman? Review the clothing policy itself. What do these rules have in common? No sleeveless or strapless tops, skirts and shorts must be an appropriate length, and no exposed midriffs. They only apply to females. In the social contract of Radnor, women are limited far more than men. The restrictions in the clothing policy pertain exclusively to women. No man is going to show up to school with an exposed midriff.
I wouldn't be so sure of that.
Ha! I couldn't possibly imagine a man with an exposed midriff.
I agree. That would be preposterous.
That's what you think.
What was that?
I'll show you an exposed midriff.
Whoa, stop that!
Hey,
Cover
hey,
that up!
oh.
Stuart Mill, stop this instant!
Sorry, guys. On a totally serious note, I do agree that the clothing policy is biased against females.
Yes, it's quite wrong. But I just can't find the right word to describe it. Misogyny.
Excuse me?
Misogyny is a word that means prejudice against women.
Ah, perfect. Where did that knowledge come from?
A certain wise man by the name of Rick.
For the most part, these guidelines apply almost exclusively towards women's clothing. The only rule that directly applies to men and boys is the one that says clothing may not be indecent or obscene, and may not have any references to sex, alcohol, drugs, or violence. All of the other ones apply to females.
Exactly my point. Here is an example. A boy comes into school wearing no shirt. He would get in slight trouble, maybe sent to the principal's office, and lectured a bit. Do you agree?
I do.
Now, if a girl came to school wearing no shirt, the punishment would be severe, and everyone would react differently. The girl would get in a tremendous amount of trouble for what would be viewed as such a scandalous action. Most of the restrictions on what clothes students may wear are like this. They are directed towards girls, and the girls must deal with stricter rules, which I believe is quite unfair.
I agree that the situation does seem unfair, but let's revisit your example. The reason a girl wouldn't be able to wear no shirt in school has nothing to do with the rules being unfair. It's more about what society thinks. We've just grown in a culture where it is not socially acceptable for girls to not have tops. There is no document, no part of the dress code stating they cannot go shirtless. It's just implied. The clothing policy outlines what kind of shirt you should wear, not whether or not you should wear a shirt.
Bingo, Locke. That's what all the rules are based on in the dress code. Society creates their own rules based on what they feel is right, and eventually they become our unwritten rules of society, the unwritten social contract. All right. A lot of great thoughts have been said this evening. Now, let's all just clarify our ideas. Let's start with you, John.
Well, I believe that.
even
Even
though-
though, fine. At first,
Listen,
even
a little
though
bit.
females all in shirts are.
So really,
Quiet down. Sorry, I should be more specific. John Locke, state what you believe in.
Still believe that the policy is immoral. An individual's freedom of speech and inalienable rights outweighs the social contract in school and even in society. A person is born with these rights that cannot be taken away from them. A social contract in school is something to be aware of, but it doesn't compare to the rights that one has, especially since the policy is so heavily biased against females.
I believe that the policy is justified. At first, I thought it was immoral because even though they consented to the social contract, consent does not always make a deal fair. However, I've switched sides. Now, I believe it is moral because of the unwritten beliefs of society.
I believe in Santa.
My wife's name is Santa.
Ha! Good one, Ellen.
Hey, my name's Todd.